and welcome to this presentation of the Vegan Society in Hawaii. Today, we're so thrilled to have with us Brenda Davis, who's a registered dietitian. She's a plant-based trailblazer and an internationally acclaimed speaker. She has been a featured speaker at medical, nutrition, and dietetic conferences in 25 countries on 6 continents. Brenda has authored or co-authored 13 books with nearly 1 million copies in print in 12 languages. Her talk is called Unleashing the Power of Plant-Based Diets. Please join me in welcoming Brenda Davis.
This is one of my very favorite topics. So we're talking about unleashing the power of plant-based diets. And we're going to begin by talking a little bit about the strength of the link between diet and disease. We'll talk about the evidence, the scientific evidence that healthy plant-based diets afford protection. We will talk about putting lifestyle medicine into action, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my experience in the Marshall Islands. And then we'll conclude with 7 steps to a truly optimal plant-based diet, particularly for reducing risk of chronic diseases and for treating chronic diseases. And that's the practical piece. So I want to begin our evening by sharing a story about my dad. And I'm going to share just a little bit about the story at the beginning, and at the very end of the presentation, I'll tell you the rest of the story. So the story, I'm guessing, I think it happened about 43 years ago. That's a stab. I was in university, and I was at home visiting my mom and dad, and I was in the kitchen preparing some food. And of course, I'm studying nutrition and health, and my dad was not exactly a health fanatic. So he liked to tease me a lot about my interest in health and nutrition. And as I'm preparing my healthy food in the kitchen, my dad saunters by me with a bag of chips and a bag of licorice, all sorts, in one hand, a huge bottle of Coke in the other, and 2 cigarettes hanging out of his mouth. He sticks his belly out as far as it would go, and he just kind of saunters by and gives me this cheeky grin. And of course, I gave him the look of disgust. And then about an hour later, I thought, I need to talk to him about this. So I went to him and I said, Dad, I don't get it. I don't understand why you're doing this to yourself. And he said to me, he said, I would sooner live 50 years having the freedom to do the things that I enjoy doing, rather than live 75 years having to restrict this and restrict that. He said, I could get hit by a truck tomorrow. And I looked at him and I said, I know, Dad, but it doesn't mean you have to walk out in front of one. And the reality is that chronic diseases account for 74% of deaths globally, and an estimated 89% of deaths in the United States. These are essentially diseases of our own making. And I think this point for many health professionals was driven very strongly by a study called the European Post-Dam study. This study was done in 2009, and they examined 4 lifestyle factors. They examined healthy diet, which they define as a high intake of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and a low intake of meat, never smoking, regular physical activity, at least 3 to 5 hours per week, and having a BMI of under 30. In other words, not being obese, which is kind of 2 of the other lifestyle factors combined, the healthy diet and the regular physical activity. But anyway, those were the 4 they looked at. And they found that individuals who practiced all 4 factors had a 78% lower risk. This is almost 80% lower risk of developing chronic diseases. And the risk was reduced by 93% for type 2 diabetes, 81% for myocardial infarction or heart attack, 50% for stroke, and 36% for cancer. Unbelievable. People sat up and took notice. Now, in 2011, the World Health Organization added one more factor, and they identified what they considered to be the 4 big lifestyle culprits. And they identified them as being alcohol, so that's the one that Post-am didn't highlight, smoking, physical inactivity, and an unhealthy diet. And the relative impact of each of these factors was beautifully quantified in this study looking at the burden of disease. And this is the U.S., this is the U.S. burden of disease. And this is the state of U.S. health. And what I want you to notice when you look at this chart up here is first of all, on the top, you can see the deaths. You can see total deaths that are in this graph. Well, in red, wherever you see on that graph red, this is actually communicable diseases. That's a very small portion of overall deaths. And then at the bottom, in the bits in green are injuries. And the rest, in blue and purple, are all the non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so forth. And then what we have is we've actually looked at which factors bear the greatest responsibility for these diseases. And at the very top of the list are dietary risks, which means an unhealthy diet is number one, is the biggest factor associated with 89% of the deaths in the United States. And then we have tobacco use. And here you see alcohol and other drug use, low physical activity. And in between here, you can see highlighted in yellow, are all the things that are kind of a combination of the ones I just mentioned. High blood pressure, high body mass index, high plasma glucose, high total cholesterol. Those kinds of things are a function of diet, exercise, all of that. In 2014, Dr. David Katz was asked to really review the evidence that we had up to that time and answer this question. Can we say what diet is best for health? And I think he answered it very eloquently and succinctly in this one sentence. He said, a diet of minimally processed foods, close to nature, predominantly plants, is decisively associated with health promotion and disease prevention. And you may be surprised to learn this, but health authorities all around the world agree. National governments agree. In Brazil, they say, eat foods mainly of plant origin. Canada, healthy eating patterns include mostly plant-based foods. China, cut meat by 50%. Denmark, eat plant-rich, varied, and not too much. Estonia, eat plant-based, biologically diverse, local, and seasonal. Germany, choose mostly plant-based foods. The Netherlands, eat less meat and more plant-based foods. Qatar, emphasize a plant-based diet. Taiwan, plant-based diets are needed to reach 2050 net zero target. The UK, eat more plant-based foods. What about the United States? Well, if you haven't seen this report, this is the scientific report of the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And they recommend a significant shift towards plant-based whole foods. They advise expanding plant-based protein options and listing these plant sources of protein ahead of the animal sources of protein. So that's coming. That's for the 25-30 guidelines. And in the report, this is a quote. They say, encourage dietary patterns that emphasize plant-based foods, such as plant-based proteins, whole grains, and vegetables. Substitution or replacement of meat with plant-based foods, such as plant-based proteins, beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds, soy, whole grains, or vegetables, is associated with favorable cardiovascular outcomes. So there's stuff is happening. You know, when I began this journey myself, it was 1989, and there weren't a lot of dietitians or physicians who were on this wavelength. I can tell you things have changed. Chronic disease authorities, the American Cancer Society says eat a healthy diet with an emphasis on plant foods. The American Heart Associations, the benefits of plant-based diets are clear: less risk of disease and improved health and well-being. The American Diabetes Association, a plant-forward way of eating is associated with improved health outcomes and a decreased risk for a variety of chronic conditions. And we have solid evidence. The reason that all of these health authorities are emphasizing the shift in a plant-based direction is because we have the evidence to substantiate that recommendation. Now, some of the most interesting evidence that I found are studies that have followed long-term populations who actually live healthy, similar healthy lifestyles, but have different dietary patterns. So there are three cohorts that I'm talking about. The first is in North America, and this is the Adventist Health Study 2. This is over 96,000 participants. The study began in 2002 and is ongoing. Then we have Epic Oxford from the UK, over 65,000 participants, began in 1993 and is ongoing. And the third, it's really two cohorts. I lumped them into one from Taiwan, the Suchi Vegetarian Study, over 12,000 individuals, and the Suchi Health Study, over 6,000 individuals. And what's really interesting about these three cohorts are that people in these health-conscious cohorts die regardless of their dietary group, whether they're omnivore or plant-based. They die at about 1/3 to 1/2 the rates of the general population in their region. And why this is significant, why this is important, is because what it means is when we're comparing vegans to lacto-ovo-vegetarians to omnivores, we're not comparing vegans to people eating a Western-style diet, sitting on the couch smoking a cigarette. We're comparing them to people who exercise the same amount, drink the same amount, and eat healthfully and smoke the same amount. So we're controlling for many confounding variables. Very, very important. So what are the findings? Well, let's take a look. In 2024, so this very recent study, all-cause mortality compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, vegetarians, including vegans, had about 11% risk reduction at age 65, and that was fully adjusted for all variables, but no significant advantage at age 85, and we'll talk a little bit about that. At age 65, vegan men had the greatest advantage, about a 28% risk reduction. At age 85, the pescatarian men had the greatest advantage. The risk reduction was about 11%. So in terms of ischemic heart disease compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, ischemic heart disease rates in Epic Oxford were 13% lower for pescatarians and 22% lower for lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans. And in the Adventist Health Study 2, the men enjoyed advantage, but the women, there were no significant differences. So for men, it was 23% lower for pescatarians, 24% lower for lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 55% lower for vegan men. So really quite a profound difference. And then in terms of deaths from ischemic heart disease, that 2024 study I mentioned, at age 65, deaths were 31% lower among vegans, 28% among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and actually 39% lower among pescatarians. And at age 85, it was 22% for vegans, 13% for lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 30% for pescatarians. So that's just interesting. Put that in your back pocket. And then we have an umbrella review that compared non-vegetarians, vegetarians, and vegans, and they found vegetarians and vegans experienced a 29% lower risk of cardiovascular disease, 14% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, 24% lower risk of ischemic heart disease, and a 32% lower risk of ischemic heart disease mortality. Hypertension, and this is just absolutely shocking, but compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, the risk was 55% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians and 75% lower among vegans in the Adventist Health Study too. We have a little bit of mixed results for strokes compared to health-conscious non-vegetarians in Epic Oxford. Hemorrhagic stroke was actually 12% higher among pescatarians and 43% higher among vegetarians and vegans. And in the Adventist Health Study too, death from stroke was 17% higher among vegetarians at age 85, although there were no increases at age 65. However, in Suchi, compared to non-vegetarians, the risk was 48% lower for overall stroke, 74% lower for ischemic stroke, and 66% lower for hemorrhagic stroke. So that is quite an interesting difference. There was also an umbrella review in 2023 that found, compared to non-vegetarians, vegetarians and vegans experienced a 41% reduced risk of cerebrovascular disease and a 33% reduced risk of ischemic stroke. In terms of diabetes, again, compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians in the Adventist Health Study 2, pescatarians had a 21% lower risk of diabetes. For lacto-ovo-vegetarians, it was 38% lower risk, and for vegans, 62% lower risk of type 2 diabetes. In Epic Oxford, it was 35% lower among lacto-ovo, 47% among vegans, and 53% among pescatarians. And then in Suchi, the risk was 51% lower among vegetarian men than non-vegetarian, and 75% lower among vegetarian women. In non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, was 21% lower among vegetarians than non-vegetarians in the Suchi studies. And replacing soy with meat or fish increased risk 12 to 13%. Replacing whole grains with refined grains increased risk 3 to 12%. For cancer in Epic Oxford, we saw 11% risk reduction among vegetarians, 12% among pescatarians, and a 19% risk reduction among vegans. In Adventist Health Study 2, it was 8% lower among vegetarians, 12% lower among pescatarians, and 16% lower among vegans. Breast cancer in Suchi was 58% lower among the vegetarians compared to the non-vegetarians. And people that ate soy foods, soy isoflavones, which come from edamame and tofu and soy milk and so forth, this was associated with a 63% risk reduction for breast cancer. Cataracts in Epic Oxford were 21% lower among pescatarians, 30% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 40% lower among vegans. Diverticular disease in Epic Oxford, 10% lower among pescatarians, 27% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 72% lower among vegans. Urinary tract infections in Suchi were 16% lower among the vegetarians compared to the non-vegetarians. Gout in Suchi was 77% lower in the Suchi Health Study and 39% lower in the Suchi vegetarian study. And then in terms of kidney disease and deaths from kidney failure, in the Adventist Health Study 2, kidney disease was 52% lower among vegetarians and vegans compared to the non-vegetarians. And deaths from kidney failure, you can see at age 65 and 85 for pescatarians, it was 39%, for age 65, 31%, for age 85. For lacto-ovo-vegetarians, even bigger numbers, 55% and 36%. And then for vegans, 63% and 42%. So really quite profound. Kidney stones were 27% lower in pescatarians, 31% lower in vegetarians and vegans in Epic Oxford. Dementia was 33% lower in Suchi, comparing the vegetarians with non-vegetarians. There was another study looking at cognitive function, and this was over 17,000 individuals. And they basically just said, well, there's no evidence that vegetarian or vegan diets increase the risk of cognitive impairment. However, there's been one study that just came out 2024. This is Gary Fraser, the Adventist Health Study, that found dementia rates were actually increased among vegetarians, but the results were not statistically significant. There were very few cases, and the confidence intervals were were very wide, meaning we did the research again, we might not have the same result. There wasn't a lot of confidence in the findings. However, that having been said, dementia was actually 26% higher at age 65 in the vegetarians, the vegans, and the pescatarians, and then 13% higher at age 85. Parkinson's disease was actually 30% lower among the vegetarians and vegans at age 65, but it was 37% higher at age 85. In terms of discussing these findings, what they suggested was that the vegetarian advantage seems to decline in very old individuals, possibly due to higher risk of mortality from neurological diseases. They said that the impact on brain health may be due to low intakes of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids and lower intakes of vitamin B12. And so this is something that requires further investigation. So at this stage, what I would recommend is a direct source of EPA and DHA for people who are consuming plant-based diets. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So were there any other negative findings beside this possible finding? And there is one, and that is for hip and bone fractures. In Epworth, Oxford, the risk of fracture was 25% higher among lacto-ovo-vegetarians compared to non-vegetarians, but it was 231% higher for vegans, which is 2.3 times higher. Vegans also had a 43%, and that was for hip fracture, and they also had a 43% higher risk of total fracture. But the higher risk was only observed in very thin individuals with a BMI under 22.5. It was increased mainly in postmenopausal women, not in men at all. And in Adventist Health Study 2, again, it was the female vegans, and they had a 55% higher risk of fracture than non-vegetarians. But when calcium and vitamin D supplementation were included in their sort of daily life, they didn't have an increased risk, and there was no association between diet and fractures in men at all. So why the increased risk? Well, vegans have the lowest BMI of all of the dietary categories. So when you're leaner and thinner, you tend to have less bone, and that puts you at higher risk. Vegetarians and vegans do also tend to consume less protein, calcium, vitamin D, zinc, and B12, all of which can increase risk. We tend to use less hormone replacement therapy and have lower IGF-1 levels. And so all of these things could combine to increase risk. There also was a 2020 review that found there's no evidence that a plant-based diet, when carefully chosen to maintain adequate calcium and vitamin D levels, has any detrimental effects on bone health. Summing up all of this evidence, there really is very clear and consistent evidence that whole plant foods are associated with a reduced risk of chronic disease, and that ultra-processed foods and meat, especially red and processed meat, are associated with an increased risk of disease. But what we need to recognize is all plant-based diets are not created equal. So diet quality matters. Like all diets, plant-based diets do need to be appropriately planned. And I think that's what really is the focus of this organization, which I'm very happy about. Now, have you ever heard of the Diet Quality Index? It's a scoring system that looks at the quality of plant-based diets, and it's called the PDI, or the Plant-Based Diet Index. They give positive scores for plant foods and reverse scores for animal foods. Then they get more granular and talk about a healthy PDI or an HPDI. They give positive scores for healthy plant foods, reverse scores for less healthy, highly processed plant foods and animal foods. And then they have a UPDI, or an unhealthful PDI. And there they give positive scores for the unhealthy plant foods like potato chips and Coke, and reverse scores for healthy plant foods and animal foods. So let's take a look at what the findings look like. Here you can see that there have been many studies using these indicators. They've looked at all-cause mortality. They've looked at heart disease and type 2 diabetes and obesity and stroke and colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, and cognitive functioning, erectile dysfunction, and all sorts of other things as well. But this gives you a kind of a little summary. And what you see is the PDI, as it increases, it's consistently associated with risk reduction. So you can see here, 24% risk reduction in all-cause mortality and 8% for heart disease, 20% for diabetes, 44% for obesity, 47% for cancer, prostate cancer progression, 46% for cognitive dysfunction. So this is pretty impressive. But what's more impressive is the HPDI. So the higher the HPDI, so the higher the intake of unprocessed, healthy whole plant foods. You can see the numbers. 8 for heart disease, minus 25%. So 25% lower risk. Type 2 diabetes, 20% for PDI, but 34% for HPDI. For obesity, 44 versus 62. So it just is even more powerful. But for UPDI, so the higher the UPDI, in every single case, you're increasing risk, from somewhere around, 5% to 45 or 94 for obesity. You can see the trend. So an unhealthy plant-based diet isn't, from a purely health perspective, a better choice. It's a better choice for the animals and the environment, but it's not necessarily a better choice for personal health. Why are healthy plant-based diets so protective? Well, it's really very simple. First, they maximize protective dietary factors like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and plant sterols and stenols and prebiotics and all of those things. And these are the factors that are really concentrated in whole plant foods. They also minimize the potentially pathogenic or harmful dietary factors like saturated fat and too much saturated fat and trans fatty acids and refined carbohydrates and chemical contaminants and inflammatory compounds like Nu-5GC and TMAO and endotoxins. And these are the factors that are concentrated in one of two places: highly processed or ultra-processed foods and animal products. And not only do plant-based diets protect against many chronic diseases, but they provide a safe and powerful treatment option, in some cases, driving these diseases into remission. And so I wanted to share a little bit about my experience in driving disease into remission with a randomized controlled trial in the Marshall Islands. So we'll talk about putting lifestyle medicine into practice. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Marshall Islands, they are actually somewhere between Hawaii and Australia. They're very remote. There's nothing close to them in any direction. And they're about 5 to 7 degrees north of the equator. So similar weather to Hawaii, I'm sure. So the Marshall Islands declared a state of emergency where diabetes is concerned. They have among the highest prevalence of type 2 diabetes and the highest death rates from diabetes globally. In 2021, the incidence was 25.1% in people ages 20 to 79, and that was actually down from over 30% previously. And about half of all surgeries on the islands are amputations due to diabetes. So was diabetes a problem in the past? Well, a century ago, type 2 diabetes was pretty much unheard of in the Marshall Islands. People were slim, they were physically active, and they lived off the land. So they had to work hard to get their food. They were spearfishing and they were climbing coconut trees. So what was the traditional diet? Well, whatever they could catch from the ocean, whatever they could collect from the island. The diets today are very different, as you probably are aware. The little girl here in the upper left, this was 6:30 in the morning. You can see what she was eating: a popsicle and a Pepsi. The little girl here, the school girl, is eating lunch, and this is a standard lunch: white rice and some chicken. The ramen noodles, the reason I put that package, that's the favorite snack of the kids there. One time I was watching this child eating the ramen. They eat it dry, right out of the pack. They eat it dry. And before this child started eating it, they sprinkled Kool-Aid powder on top to flavor it. I was just shocked. And then they took this little white package out of their pocket and cracked it open. I said to the Marshallese person next to me, "What in the heck is that?" And they said, "Oh, that's a Sinamoto." So that's basically pure MSG to sprinkle a little extra flavor on top. So that is one of their favorite snacks. And then this was a funeral meal. So you can see a white ham sandwich, white soda biscuits, white donut, white rice, and meat. This at the bottom here is a first birthday party. And these bins are just filled with meat, mostly highly processed meat, then big mounds of white rice. The number one beverage is luau. First ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. I think that's what's in this bottle this little toddler is drinking. And then, of course, Spam and other processed meats are very popular. So, I mean, it'd be hard to design a diet to induce diabetes any more efficiently than the diet that the Marshallese people have unfortunately adopted. The reason why they've shifted from their traditional diet to this kind of diet is because if you look at Majuro, which is their main island with 30,000 people, well, that island might sustain 500 or 1,000 people with 30,000 people there. They have to import food. They're poor. They don't make a lot of money. And so they import inexpensive, shelf-stable garbage. And that's the problem. We went into the Marshall Islands to do a trial. We had 169 adults, 5 overlapping cohorts, and our participants were randomized to an intervention group, which was basically plant-based diet and exercise, or a control group, which was standard medical care, or SMC. We put them through 12 weeks of pretty intensive lifestyle medicine, and with a focus, as I mentioned, on a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet and exercise, but we touched on all the pillars of lifestyle medicine, every single one in our education sessions. The diet was very high fiber, about 40 grams a day, high in phytochemicals and antioxidants, minimal highly processed foods, fairly low in fat, about 20% of the calories, most of which came from nuts and seeds and tofu and things like that. What were the results? So here they are. They've been published, and I'll show you the paper. But you can see in the first 2 weeks, fasting blood sugar dropped an average of 72 milligrams per deciliter. At 12 weeks, it was 45. At 24 weeks, it was 25. We did the lifestyle, the very intensive for 12 weeks. And then the second 12 weeks, they were on their own. So, of course, the results are going to be a little less impressive as time goes. And then A1C dropped 2 points at 12 weeks and 1.4 at 24 weeks. But what was interesting is we used a tool called the medication effects score and estimated that the A1C would have dropped 2.4% at 12 weeks and 1.6 at 24 weeks had their medications not been reduced. We had to reduce their medications to prevent hypoglycemia. And then CRP dropped anywhere between 1 and 1.5 points. That's a measure of inflammation. Weight dropped about 3.3 pounds at 2 weeks, about 6.2 at 12, and about 5.5 at 24. HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance, dropped 1.5 at 2, 2.8, and then 2.5. And then triglycerides fell 47 milligrams per deciliter in the first 2 weeks. Unbelievable. And then at 12 weeks, it was 38, and at 24 weeks, it was 20. I can tell you we had 23% of participants with a baseline A1C under 9 that actually achieved remission. And remission, of course, we defined as having an A1C under 6.5% at least 3 months after following the protocol. 63% of medicated patients actually reduced their glucose-lowering medications. And participants reported less pain, less disability, clearer thinking, better sleep, and less constipation. And I have to tell you, the less constipation, they were eating probably 5 to 10 grams of fiber a day. And all of a sudden, they're eating 50 grams of fiber a day. It scared them. It did. I had people come in and say to me, I'm not sure if I'm okay. I'm going to the bathroom every single day. And I'm getting really big, really, and so it was just such a shock to them that they were going to the bathroom every day. We had, in our first cohort, we had one man that hadn't had a bowel movement in 13 days. Well, having once a week was really pretty normal in that culture. So that was success for sure. So these are publications. This is where our protocol was published. This is 2019. And there I am, and there's the results paper, 2024 in Diabetologia, which is a very prestigious diabetes journal. And I'm very, very proud of that work. The people in the Marshall Islands, they provided really hope amid a very deep sense of hopelessness there, because the people there really believed that diabetes was just the luck of the draw. It was, they had no control over whether or not they would have diabetes, and so many people did. It was almost expected. They proved that diabetes could be effectively treated with healthy food and exercise and lifestyle changes. They succeeded despite really very poor quality of the produce, because you can imagine if it's being shipped by boat, it can take a couple of weeks to get there. If it's flown in, it's so expensive, nobody can afford it. They do grow some, but it's limited. These are coral atolls, so there's not a lot of really good soil there. And they persevered amidst mountains of Spam, ramen noodles, sticky rice donuts, sweet drinks, all of that. They managed with very few gyms. I think ours was one of the only one at our clinic, and no walking trails at all. But I can also tell you that we started having walkathons and really shutting roads down at certain times of the day and getting people interested in fitness. It was really quite wonderful. And people often ask me, do you think this kind of program could work at home? And I just say, if there's hope in the Marshall Islands, given the enormous barriers they face, there's certainly hope at home. I think what are our excuses? We have none compared to them. But the hope rests with the integration of lifestyle medicine into our healthcare systems. It really needs to become a treatment option. And in my view, we know enough. We know enough to make lifestyle medicine the first line of therapy for lifestyle-induced chronic diseases. We need to stop just putting bandages on these diseases and start getting to the root of the problem. So now we're moving on to the practical piece. 7 steps to an optimal plant-based diet for the prevention of disease and the treatment of disease. So step number 1, make unprocessed or minimally processed high-fiber foods the foundation of the diet, regardless of the type of dietary pattern you're on. These should be the foundation. The goal is 9 or more servings of vegetables and fruits a day. This is not a diet of deprivation. This is a diet of beautiful, colorful, delicious foods. Legumes, I would say if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, it should be 3 or more servings a day, something with every meal, preferably. Whole grains, for most people, it be maybe 3 to 5 servings a day. If you're very active and an athlete, you'll need more. If you're trying to lose weight, have type 2 diabetes, you may need even less. Nuts and seeds, 1 or more serving a day. And then you want to anoint it all with generous amounts of herbs and spices. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why for all of these. The other thing is we need to ensure adequate intakes of essential nutrients. And plant-based diets tend to be higher than omnivorous diets in folate, vitamin C, K, E, copper, iron, magnesium, and potassium than omnivorous diets. And I'll say iron, even though we consume more as vegans, higher than lacto-ovo vegetarians or omnivores, we don't absorb it quite as well. So it's still a nutrient that deserves some attention. Nutrients that may fall short are B12, calcium, vitamin D, iodine, zinc, and omega-3 fatty acids. So we need to make sure we have a source of those. And plant-based food guides can really help with that task. And these are 2 guides that I've had a hand in developing. This one was in Nourish, which I did with a pediatrician. So this is kind of a guide for families. And then these are, becoming vegan and plant-powered protein and Kick Diabetes Essentials, Kick Diabetes Cookbook. This is the guide that we used there. Step number 2 is to ditch ultra-processed foods. And we could put a quote on foods because they're not really foods. So what are they? Well, they're nutrient-poor, energy-dense, industrially processed so-called foods made from cheap, highly refined carbohydrates, fats, and sometimes proteins. To make these things look and taste like real food and to enhance their shelf life, We add anti-caking agents, artificial sweeteners, bulking agents, defoaming agents, dyes. We add colors, emulsifiers, flavors, glazing agents, preservatives, and stabilizers. And examples of ultra-processed foods are sugar-sweetened beverages, pre-sweetened breakfast cereals, commercial white flour products, salty snacks, packaged fried noodles, processed meats, chicken or fish nuggets, fish sticks, most ice creams, most commercial ice creams, processed cheese and cheese spreads, ready-to-eat frozen dinners, frozen pizzas, all of that stuff, margarines, shortenings. There was a study that came out in 2024. It was actually an umbrella review. That's sort of the highest level of evidence. It was a review of 45 meta-analyses. They reported that ultra-processed foods are directly linked to 32 harmful health effects, including an increased risk of death, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, cancer, mental health disorders, and sleep disorders. And so how do they do this? Well, they displace healthy foods. When you're eating these ultra-processed foods, you're not eating something that's healthier. So they reduce your diet quality. They contribute to weight gain by increasing energy intake if you're eating a lot of them by an estimated 500 calories a day. I'll tell you how in a second. They concentrate harmful components like added sugars, solid fats, sodium, industrial processing products, and food additives. They reduce protective components like fiber and antioxidants and phytochemicals, and they alter the food matrix, which can negatively affect satiety and nutrient absorption and so forth. And these things are actually physically addictive. The flavors concentrated in UPF are actually very dilute in nature. And when these flavors are combined in a single food, it makes them hyper-palatable. And it's very difficult to stop eating them. They cause intense cravings. In fact, they evoke similar levels of dopamine in the brain to those seen with nicotine and alcohol. Unbelievable. And American diets, on average, are 60% of calories from UPF. And at the upper end, it's over 80% of calories from UPF. So that's bad news. Step number 3 is to be picky about your carbohydrates. You know, contrary to popular opinion, carbohydrates are not the enemy. Carbohydrates from whole foods are consistently protective to human health. In fact, the populations who have the lowest levels of these diseases are populations that have relatively high carbohydrate intakes. If we look at carbohydrates and disease risk, it's really the quality of carbohydrates that determines health outcomes. And quality is a function of the source of the carbohydrates and the degree of processing of those carbohydrates. So when we think about carbohydrate quality, high carbohydrates are those that are intrinsic to whole plant foods like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, nuts and seeds. These foods, of course, are packaged with all of those good things we talked about, like fiber and antioxidants. Low-quality carbohydrates, on the other hand, are carbohydrates that have essentially been stripped of their protective components by food processing techniques before we eat them. And this includes refined sugars like white sugar, refined starches like white flour products, white rice, and even refined starchy vegetables like potato chips. Low-quality carbohydrates increase our risk of overeating and obesity, metabolic-associated fatty liver disease, insulin resistance and diabetes, high triglycerides, and heart disease. And there was an umbrella review on sugar and health in 2023, over 8,600 articles and 73 meta-analyses. And they found added sugars have significant harmful associations with 18 endocrine and metabolic outcomes, 10 cardiovascular outcomes, 7 cancer outcomes, and 10 other outcomes. And the authors suggested that what we need to do is eat less than 6 teaspoons of sugar a day, which is about 25 grams, and less than 1 sweet drink a week. And they counted one drink as 7 to 12 ounces. Well, how much sugar do we get in foods that we're typically consuming? Well, we get double that, 6 teaspoons in one serving of a sweet food, like a 12-ounce can of soda, or a large flavored coffee, or 1 cup of fruit-flavored yogurt, or a large pastry like a cinnamon bun. And we get close to that from foods we don't even think of as being big sugar sources, like energy bars and barbecue sauce and instant or flavored cereals. The average adult in the United States consumes 17 teaspoons of sugar a day. And for teens, it's even more. It's about 21 teaspoons. And if you're looking at a food label, 4 grams of sugar on a label is 1 teaspoon. So you can kind of calculate that way how much is in a food. About half of the sugars consumed in the United States come from sweet beverages, and almost a half and almost a third come from sweets and snacks. So if we just eliminated those 2 things, we'd be in pretty good shape. So it's a similar song and dance for refined starches. If you take a kernel of wheat or a bag of wheat and you turn it into white flour, you're essentially removing 2 of the 3 parts of the kernel of wheat, the bran and the germ. That just happens to be where the fiber and the nutrients and phytochemicals are stored. What we're left with is endosperm, which is mainly starch. And in the process of doing that, we lose 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals, and 95% of the protective phytochemicals. And then, of course, who eats a bowl of white flour? Nobody. Before you eat the white flour, what do? Well, we tend to add fat and sugar and salt and food additives, and then we eat the white flour. And therein lies the problem. Not only have we removed most of what is of value to human health, but we've added a bunch of components that we know are associated with an increased risk. So this is a double whammy. On the other hand, whole grains are healthy foods. There was a meta-analysis of 45 studies that reported a reduced risk of mortality for every 3 servings of whole grains we consume per day. All-cause mortality dropped 17%, cardiovascular mortality 22%, diabetes mortality 51%, cancer mortality 15%, and respiratory disease mortality 22%. But all whole grains are not created equal. And a lot of people miss this point. A granola bar doesn't equal a bowl of oatmeal. A box of organic kamut flakes does not equal a kamut berry salad. Okay, there is a hierarchy of whole grains. And I developed this hierarchy because what I was seeing in a lot of programs, even CHIP and some of the lifestyle medicine programs, where people were eating a lot of processed whole grains, breads and cereals, and thinking that all whole grains are equal. But at the very top of the hierarchy are grains almost as they're picked from the plant, just the husk removed. And so things like barley and oat groats and quinoa, kamut berries, wheat berries, these kinds of foods, they're intact. Nothing healthy has been removed. Nothing unhealthy has been added. And then we cut the grains like steel cut oats, and then we roll them like rolled oats, and then we shred them like shredded wheat, and then we grind them like whole wheat flour, and then we flake them like flaked cereals, and then we puff them like puffed wheat or puffed brown rice. This isn't refined, this isn't white flour products. This is just whole grains. But as you go down the list, you increase the surface area of the food and the rate at which it will be absorbed into the bloodstream. Okay? So it increases the glycemic impact of the food. You also expose the food to heat, light, oxygen, pressure, all of which damage nutrients and phytochemicals. And so if you're dealing with, not that you can never eat bread or enjoy some sort of flaked cereal, but just know that if you're fighting diabetes or heart disease or a disease where you need to be a little stricter with your food intake, steering nearer to the top of the hierarchy makes an enormous difference, especially for diabetes. And so just this is, I think, something important for people to recognize. We want to get our carbohydrates from high fiber whole plant foods. We want to avoid sugars. We want to minimize all refined carbohydrates, period. Step number 4 is to pick plant protein sources instead of meat. And this comes as a surprise to the mainstream world because meat has been held on a pedestal for many years, thinking that, well, where would you get your protein if you don't eat meat, right? But if you look at legumes, which are the main protein source in the plant-based world versus meat, and you think about the components in foods you're trying to increase, like fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidants, pre and probiotics, plant sterols and stanols, those kinds of things are all high or very high in legumes, and they are pretty much absent or very low in meat. The components that we talked about that are problematic, that are pathogenic, like too much saturated fats, trans fatty acids, new 5-GC, TMAO and its precursors, pro-oxidants like heme iron, products of high temperature cooking, endotoxins, all of those things are really low or zero in legumes, and they tend to be moderate to high in meat. So it should come as no surprise that when we investigate, and there have been a number of studies that have looked at what happens if you take animal protein and swap it for plant protein. And one of the first studies that I think was really remarkable was done by Dr. Song in 2016, a Harvard study. And what they did was they looked at what would happen if you took only 3% of calories from meat and replaced it with plant protein. 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet is 60 calories. That's less than one large egg. That's about an ounce to an ounce and a half of meat or processed meat. And so it's a very tiny amount of animal protein. Swap it for plant protein, which is legumes usually. And what would happen? Well, if what you were replacing was processed meat with legumes, death would be reduced by 34%. So what would happen if we doubled that and said 6% of calories? 68%? So it's really a remarkable number. If you swap eggs, a reduction of 19%, unprocessed meat 12, dairy 8, poultry or fish 6. And then in Japan, they use the very same metric, and they found replacing just 3% of calories from meat with plant protein actually reduced total mortality 34% if they replaced red meat and 46% if they replaced processed meat. For cancer, mortality was 42% for red meat and 50% for processed meat. Unbelievable. And then in 2020, the U.S. National Institutes of Health did another study using that same metric, and they got a 21 to 24% risk reduction if what they replaced was eggs, or 13 to 15% for red meat, 8% for dairy, and 2% for white meat for men, and 5% for women. And then there was another study that looked at red meat and processed meat and mortality. This was a 2023 umbrella review of 40 meta-analyses. And they found high consumption of red and processed meat was associated with higher all-cause mortality and chronic disease. For every additional 3.5 ounce serving of red meat, type 2 diabetes increased 17%, coronary heart disease 15%, hypertension 14%, and stroke 12%. And then for every 50 grams, and this is 1.75 ounces of processed meat, type 2 diabetes risk increased 37%, coronary heart disease 27%, stroke 17%, and all-cause mortality 15%. We see the exact opposite for legumes and mortality. We have a 2023 meta-analysis of 32 cohorts, over 1 million participants, reported a 6% drop in mortality for every 50 grams. That's a quarter cup serving of cooked legumes. Then there was another study, people 70 plus years of age. They reported a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality for every 20 grams or 2 tablespoons of legumes consumed. Based on that study, eating a cup of beans every day would reduce mortality by 60 to 68%. So, of course, people ask the question, well, can we really get enough protein from plants? And the answer is absolutely. Plants can provide plenty of protein and all the essential amino acids people need. Plant protein has been found to be just as effective as animal protein in promoting muscle growth if intakes of protein are sufficient. This guy is Neme Delgado. He's been vegetarian from birth. He's been vegan since 2015. He has never eaten meat in his life. He looks like he's doing okay. I just like looking at that. So how much protein do we actually need? It's in grams per kilogram per day, and a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. But children need about a gram of protein per kilogram body weight. Teens need about 0.85, adults about 0.8. Pregnant and lactating women need more, about 1.1 in pregnancy, 1.3 in lactation. So how much protein does that equal? And this is just referring to a reference body weight in red to the left here, but we would have to calculate it for our own body weight. But when you calculate protein needs, it is based on healthy body weight, not actual body weight. So if you weigh 200 pounds, but your healthy body weight is 160, you calculate your protein requirements based on 160 pounds. Children need somewhere between about 13 and 34 grams of protein a day. Teens and adults about 46 to 56 grams a day. We may want to increase that a little bit during our senior years, and if you're an athlete, we'll talk about that. And it's about 63 to 75 for pregnant and lactating women. We don't have a separate RDA for athletes, but health authorities recommend 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And that isn't that hard for them to achieve because they're eating so many calories. So what about for older adults? Well, we don't have a separate RDA for seniors in North America, but there are separate RDAs or recommended intakes in many countries. So all of the Nordic countries, Australia, Germany, there are a lot of countries with separate requirements for seniors. And consensus is building that seniors do better, or older adults, at 1 to 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, because as we get older, we don't digest it as well. We don't build muscle as well. To reduce our risk of sarcopenia, or to reduce our risk of osteoporosis, to reduce our risk of frailty, having a little bit more protein may be an advantage. And achieving these intakes for seniors is so much harder than it is for athletes because we're eating fewer calories. So it means we need a little higher percentage of protein in our diet. So a little more focus on legumes and in the diet than what we might need to do as younger adults. And in my clinical experience, I've dealt with a lot of whole food plant-based eaters, especially women, who eat what looks like a beautifully healthy diet, but they're only eating about 35 to 45 grams of protein a day. And that, to be honest, is not sufficient. So these individuals are often not concerned about protein because the mantra in the plant-based world is if you get enough calories, you get enough protein. And that's almost always true. But often these people aren't eating that many calories, so they may not be getting enough protein, especially in light of the fact that they may need a little bit more. And so what do we see with a little bit of a shortfall in protein? Well, we see skin fragility, so a lot of breaking and bleeding. We see hair loss, brittle nails, muscle weakness, fatigue, inability to fight infection, poor wound healing, long recovery times, and even mood changes. And I want to share a testimony of a lady that I worked with who said, you can share my story just to get the point across. So this is what she said. She said, I was frustrated by many symptoms after following a whole food plant-based diet for some time. I wondered if I was getting enough protein, but the plant-based doctors I was following told me that protein was not the issue. Brenda Davis assessed my diet and suggested increasing my protein intake from 35 to 40 grams a day to about 60 to 70 grams a day. I feel better and look better. My skin is vastly improved on increased protein. No band-aids, no bleeding, more opaque, and much less bruising. My abdomen is receding. These are issues I've dealt with since my mid-70s, and now at 83 years of age, they're clearing up. I think it's really important that older adults know that even on a healthy whole foods plant-based diet, protein can fall short, and increasing protein intake can be very helpful. And so here's what I did. This is how simple it is. So here you see the diet. at what she was consuming. Oatmeal with almond milk, bananas, flax seeds, a green salad, non-fat dressings, some bread with hummus and tomatoes, a fresh orange, and then a stuffed sweet potato with black bean and corn filling and broccoli and, some avocado on top, a bit of chia pudding with blueberry sauce. I mean, this is a really lovely whole food plant-based diet, but she was only getting here in this particular day was 41 grams of protein. So what did I do to bring it up to 72 grams of protein? Well, it was actually really simple. So you can see in the red text, these are substitution. In the orange, these are additions. And so I substituted the almond milk at breakfast and supper for soy milk. And then I substituted the dressing, which is a sugar-based dressing, for a tahini hemp seed dressing. And then the only things I added were 1 tablespoon of hemp seeds at breakfast and 1/3 of a cup of tofu at lunchtime. And that brought us to 72 grams of protein. So really very easy to do. So ensuring adequate protein is really about eating a variety of plant foods over the course of the day and eating sufficient calories. But it's also about selecting some protein choice at each meal, like beans, lentils, or peas, tofu, tempeh, edamame, tan, nuts, seeds. These are all count. Include some lower fiber choices in the mix, like tofu, soy, peanut butter, seitan, can all work, or even veggie meats if you include those. Select a plant-based milk that is higher in protein, like a soy or a pea milk. Step number 5 is to replace harmful sources of fat with healthy sources of fat. Type and quality of fat really matters. Trans fatty acids, saturated fats, and oxidized fats are associated with adverse health outcomes. Unsaturated fatty acids, on the other hand, reduce risk of disease. And so what about whole foods versus concentrated fats and oils? Well, the healthiest sources of fats are whole plant foods because they provide mostly unsaturated fats, most of them with the exception of coconut, of course, including essential fatty acids, and they provide so many protective components. And I'm not saying coconut is bad for you. You can eat coconut as part of a healthy diet. It's just a little higher in saturated fat than most of the other plant foods. And saturated fats are not poison. We all eat saturated fats. Even, nuts and seeds contain saturated fat. Even leafy greens contain some saturated fat. All whole foods contain some saturated fat. It's when we get too much that we end up with a problem. Concentrated fats and oils, on the other hand, are very calorically dense, 120 calories per tablespoon. They don't have a lot of nutrients, maybe a little vitamin E, maybe a little vitamin K, maybe some polyphenols if we're talking about an extra virgin olive oil or a fresh pressed oil, but otherwise they don't have a lot of nutrient density. If we use them, be very judicious with our use and choose high quality, like fresh pressed products. The most harmful fats are trans fat, saturated fat, and oxidized fat. Trans fatty acids are the most damaging of all dietary fats. They're consistently associated with increased mortality and morbidity. Industrially produced trans fatty acids have been banned in the US, so we're seeing dramatically reduced levels in processed foods. However, manufacturers can label products trans-free if they have less than 0.5 grams per serving. So if you're eating 10 servings of something, you can still get a pretty significant amount. So natural trans fatty acids in dairy products and meat, we used to think they might not be as damaging, but there's research suggesting they may have similar impacts to industrially produced trans fats. Saturated fats are associated with increased total mortality, hyperlipidemia, and cardiovascular disease, some cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, inflammation, and an increase in visceral fat deposits. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat for cardiovascular disease risk reduction. And that's 16 grams in a 2,000 calorie diet. Of course, the key sources are red meat, processed meat, whole milk, and other dairy products, and tropical oils, and lard, of course. So how much do we get from various foods? Well, you can see just one serving of a meat lover's pizza, double cheeseburger, or a soft taco with beef and cheese exceed that upper limit recommended by the American Heart Association. A cup of milk and 1 ounce of cheese, you're at 12 grams. With plant foods, even high-fat plant foods, you're looking at less than 2 grams, with the exception of tropical oils and coconut. Generally, even if you're eating a very whole food plant-based diet with some coconut, your intake is still minuscule in comparison to what you would get on an omnivorous diet. Oxidized fats are something we need to be aware of. Exposing fatty acids to high temperatures, like frying or grilling, promotes the formation of harmful products of oxidation, like hydroperoxides and aldehydes. We need to be aware of that. This can contribute to oxidative stress and chronic inflammation. So we really try to reduce any deep frying or frying of foods. Now, the other thing that comes up with that is, don't we need fish for omega-3 fatty acids? Well, not necessarily. Omega-3s also come from plants. Land plants like seeds like chia flax and hemp seeds, nuts like walnuts, and then some novel sources like ahi flour, perilla, and echium seed oils. But they also come from sea plants. So there are microalgae in the form of supplements that provide EPA and DHA. And microalgae is where fish get their omega-3s. So they consume microalgae and it moves up the food chain. That's where it comes from. So we're literally growing, we're culturing it. We're bypassing the fish to get the EPA and DHA. Macroalgae provides a little bit of EPA, not a lot unless you're eating tons of it. And eggs provide a little bit of DHA for lacto-ovo vegetarians. So how do we optimize omega-3s in a plant-based diet? Well, we need to get enough ALA. And if you don't consume EPA and DHA, you should double the recommended intakes. So you're looking at about 2 to 3 grams for most people would be reasonable if you're on a plant-based diet. But I would suggest considering a direct source of EPA and DHA, and it's getting cheaper and easier to find. There are tons of vegan EPA DHA supplements. I would suggest 300 to 500 milligrams per day for most people. If your omega-3 index is very low, you might want to go a little higher, around 1,000, 1,500 milligrams a day. Step number 6 is to maximize phytochemicals and antioxidants. And these things generally, they serve us by reducing oxidative stress and inflammation, by enhancing gut microbiota, by improving fasting glucose and insulin sensitivity, and by supporting immune function and protecting against DNA damage. So what are the most phytochemical and antioxidant-rich foods? Well, whole plant foods, fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, all of that. Herbs and spices are very concentrated sources. Sprouts, fermented foods, and teas like green tea and herbal tea. So to maximize intake, we want to go for variety. Some people say at least 30 different plant foods a day. Sometimes I think I get 30 different plant foods in one meal, but it's something to strive for. The wider the variety of plant foods, the wider the variety of phytochemicals and antioxidants. You want to go for color because color reflects the amount of these compounds that are present. So you might want to pick purple instead of white onions, black instead of brown rice, dark instead of light greens. You want to eat a whole rainbow of fruits and vegetables. I suggest 3 green, 2 orange, 2 red, pink, 1 purple, blue, 1 light beige. Just try to make your salad a rainbow. I always try myself to get every color in the salad. You want to eat more raw foods because generally raw foods contain enzymes that actually are responsible for converting certain phytochemicals into their bioactive metabolites or their active forms. And so, for example, myrosinase in cruciferous vegetables converts glucosinolates into isothiocyanates, which help to kick in the phase 2 enzyme systems, which helps to get rid of potential carcinogens from the body. Alanase, the alanase in allium vegetables converts allan to allicin. So including some raw foods can be very helpful. We want to start sprouting foods more because when you sprout a seed, You're literally telling that seed to get ready to support the life of a new plant. A little baby plant needs protection. And so the phytochemical army in that seed just explodes to protect that little baby plant, often by 5 to 50 times. Like in broccoli sprouts, it's around 50 times more sulforaphane compared to mature broccoli. And then we want to pile on the herbs and spices, gram for gram. These are some of our strongest sources. Drink antioxidant-rich teas. And then step number 7 is to minimize dietary contaminants. So the worst offenders are environmental contaminants and the byproducts of high temperature cooking. And these things can increase oxidative stress and inflammation, disrupt hormones, damage vital organs, and they can damage the DNA and the central nervous system. And so what we're talking about is pesticides in conventional produce, heavy metals like mercury in fish and seafood, arsenic in rice, chicken, fish, and seaweed, persistent organic pollutants like PCBs and dioxins that move up the food chain in meat and dairy products, and then microplastics. We've been hearing more about these things, and these are most concentrated in seafood and salt. But they're also in things that are packaged in plastic, like bottled water, honey, sugar, beer, chicken nuggets, rice, milk, meat, fruit, even some root vegetables are sources. And the solutions here are to eat lower on the food chain. Choose organic foods when you can. Vary your grains. If rice is a key, food in your diet, just be aware that it's one of the more concentrated sources of inorganic arsenic. Rice-based beverages, brown rice syrup, rice-based snacks are really best minimized. To reduce arsenic in rice, what you can do is cook it in a lot of water, like 6 parts water to 1 part rice. You'll get rid of about 80% of the arsenic. If you want to preserve the nutrients, you can do that for 5 minutes and then cook as usual, 2 parts water to 1 part rice. And to reduce exposure to microplastics, we want to avoid single-use plastics, bottled water, plastic cutting boards, plastic utensils, microwaving in plastic, store food in glass containers instead, and reduce your intake of UPFs, and limit intake of seafood, salt, especially Himalayan pink sea salt, black salt, and sea salt, surprisingly, are more concentrated than other salts, and then other foods that I mentioned as well. Products of high temperature cooking like heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acrylamide, and advanced glycation end products, the most concentrated sources of these compounds, heterocyclic amines in processed meat, especially fried, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, anything that you blacken, acrylamide, potato chips, any potato products, and advanced glycation end products, processed meats are the most concentrated sources. These things can actually damage DNA. There was a 2023 study that showed that high temperature cooking damages the DNA of food, and that when we consume that DNA, it can negatively impact the DNA of the consumer. So, and meat is the most concentrated source. So we want to avoid charred and blackened foods, especially meat, poultry, and fish. We want to avoid deep fried foods, use moist cooking methods. You want to use moist cooking methods like steaming, stewing, water sauteing to get fewer products of oxidation. And the take-home message of this presentation is every time you eat or drink, you either feed disease or you fight disease. Well-designed, whole food, plant-based diets are the safest, most effective ways of preventing and treating lifestyle-induced diseases. But perhaps the most compelling reasons to eat plant-based are those that extend beyond human health. Plant-based diets are the most ecologically sustainable diet. Compared to vegan diets, the carbon footprint is 3.2 times greater for omnivorous diets and 4.2 times greater for keto diets. Plant-based diets, to me, are the most ethically justifiable diets. In 2023, over 90 billion animals were slaughtered for food. Eating plant-based reduces pain, suffering, and death in animals. By getting our nutrition from plants, we all win. And as human beings, we have a responsibility to make choices that support and protect the life support systems of our planet. Plant-based lifestyles are rapidly becoming an ecological and an ethical imperative. And now I want to conclude with telling you the rest of the story about my dear father. My dad died in 2011, probably about a year after my interaction with my dad. He had a stroke at work, and he was taken to emergency by ambulance. His blood pressure was 220/110, and his blood sugar was over 500 milligrams per deciliter. And I remember, I'll never forget, I was in my dad's room when the doctor told him that if he didn't stop smoking, he'd probably live for 3 months. He was about, 49 years old, Mom? 48 years old. And he told him that if he did stop smoking, he might live 3 years. And I'll never forget sitting on my dad's bed, and I could just see the tears coming down. And he said to me, he said, "What was I thinking?" He said, "I don't want to die." He said, I want to see my grandchildren grow up. I want to dance with my sweetheart at our 50th wedding anniversary. And I really think it was at that point that my dad finally understood that without health, there is no freedom. When your health is taken away, your freedom is taken away. When you're hooked up to a dialysis machine, you don't have a lot of freedom. My dad survived 26 years, which was a bit of a miracle, and he did make changes. You know, I think he ate oatmeal and blueberries with flax seeds on top, more than bacon and eggs. And he started biking and really trying to make a difference. He never went vegetarian. He never made the grand changes I wish he would have made, but I'm very grateful for the extra years that we got with him. And I just want to say that my parents did dance together at their 50th wedding anniversary. And I think for that, we'll all be very grateful. But, you know, the point being that we have so much power to influence the course of our lives, and so much is about the choices we make. And when we set an example for our families, it's one of the greatest gifts that we can give them. And so with that, I will say thank you so much to all of you for being here tonight. I hope that you learned a few things, have a few more things to think about. So probably the best sources apart from legumes would be seeds. And so seeds are, especially hemp and pumpkin seeds, they're really, really good sources. And I love adding hemp seeds to smoothies if you're doing smoothies, because they don't make it gluey like flax and chia seeds do. So you can blend them and you get some good essential fatty acids and really wonderful source of protein. Of course, nuts are a reasonable source of protein, and some grains more so than others, but it's surprising that a cup of Kemet berries or spelt or wheat berries will have 10 to 12 grams of protein, and quinoa is only about 8 grams. So people are sometimes surprised by that. But certainly we get protein from all whole plant foods. With the exception, we get a little tiny bit from fruits, but fruits are much lower, but 1 to 10% of calories for protein, compared to about 20 to 40% in legumes. And it's in that range for most non-starchy vegetables as well. So, but you'd have to eat a lot of, like spinach has the same percent of calories for protein as, hamburger meat, for example. But you'd need a 3-ounce serving of, a burger patty to get 20 grams of protein. You'd need about 25 cups of spinach. So, because it has so few calories. With stroke, I think one of the issues is sodium. And we tend to see more strokes in individuals having higher sodium diets. And often even people eating very good whole food, plant-based diets are eating a lot of sodium. And so I think we need to be aware of that. And so why that, it was really interesting that the research is kind of all over the place with plant-based communities. And I was interested that that in the Suu Kyi studies, they were so protected against stroke, when we would think in Asian cuisine, you've got more sodium. So I thought that was quite an interesting finding, whereas in Epic Oxford, the rates of stroke were significantly higher. But again, the quality of the plant-based diet in Epic Oxford was not quite as high as it was in the Adventist Health Study too. And in several of the earlier Adventist Health Studies too, they were actually protected against stroke. So I think, this latest study, the 2024 study showing, I think, a 17% increased risk at age 85. Again, we're really not sure. But sodium, I think, is one of the bigger issues. I would guess it's probably because they've got very wonderful lifestyle medicine professor there who's board certified from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. And I have to say, 35, 37 years ago when I started on this path, I never imagined we'd be where we are today. It is just astounding what the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, I remember our first conference, and even I had the privilege of being one of the reviewers for the first board exams. There was maybe 150 people at that first conference. Now there are branches all over the world. There are thousands of people that come to the conferences. And we're seeing more and more young physicians who are really passionate about lifestyle medicine because they don't want to just be prescribing medications to their patients. They want to be seeing their patients actually get well. And so things have really changed, and I imagine things will start changing in medical schools as well. Thank you for the question about the omega-3s that I would recommend. I think there are many good products. Joe Furman's line of products is always a good option. There are the one like NutriVeg, there's Omega Zen 3, there's Ovega 3. There are a lot of really decent products that are, it's cultured microalgae. So there's no raping of the oceans, none of that. It's grown like you would grow something on a farm. And so there's no damage to the oceans when you're creating this stuff. So I think you can, if you, even on Amazon, if you go into Amazon, you can find a number of, and it'll say, vegan right on the labels, so that they're, remember when they first came out, Martech had a product, I think in the, or probably late 90s, something like that, but it was encapsulated in gelatin. That was the first that we had. And it was just I was just rejoicing when we finally, were able to purchase truly vegan products. So Dr. Furman has a line of supplements that is very, I think, just very thoughtfully created and very, very reliable. Yeah. So what we see globally in terms of recommended intakes for calcium, there's a pretty wide range. So in the UK, adults, it's 700 milligrams per day, whereas in North America, for women over 50 and men over 70, it's 1,200. And you see even World Health Organization, Australia, a lot of countries shoot to the higher numbers for calcium. I think the UK is a little low, to be honest, but of course, calcium balance will, if you eat a lot of animal protein, if you eat a lot of salt, there are things that can change your calcium balance. And so you might need a little bit more if you're eating more of those kinds of, higher sodium, higher meat diet than you would if you were eating a really healthy, whole food, plant-based diet. But that having been said, we're still at fairly high risk for osteoporosis, and we want to do everything we can to maintain a good, strong bone. So I would say aiming, even on a really good whole food plant-based diet for at least 1,000 milligrams a day. I think, trying for the 1,200 if you're above 50 for a woman and 70 for a man is a reasonable thing to do. That's not easy if you're not including any fortified food. So having some sort of fortified soy milk or something like that makes it actually pretty easy to achieve those numbers. I know for myself, I do have fortified soy milk, and I'm consistently pretty close to the 1,200 milligrams a day. So, it varies. So there are some people, like I know my husband, for example, he sweats a lot when he works out. I don't. He needs more salt than me. And so when, if I reduce sodium too low, he starts to get problems like headaches and stuff like that. He needs a little bit more sodium than I. But for most people, I think, 1,500 milligrams a day is ample. And going lower than that may not be enough for some people. So, but we don't want to go over 2,300 unless you are an athlete where you're sweating a lot and need a little bit more. But for most people, if you have high blood pressure, you want to, 1,200 to 1,500 is probably as high as you should be going. The question is, that years ago, we used to hear a lot that we needed to combine our proteins to ensure complete protein. So because legumes tend to be a little bit low in methionine and cysteine, and grains tend to be a little bit low in lysine, well, if we eat them together, then we're getting that sort of complete protein that you would get if you eat meat or dairy products, for example. And the answer is, this was something that was proposed by Frances Moore in the 80s. And probably about 10 years after she proposed it, she sort of took back and said, whoops, we know now we don't actually have to do that, even though it makes sense. So let's say you were eating a very limited diet. Your protein intake was just barely adequate. Having those kinds of combinations could help, especially if you're a growing child. But generally, what happens is if you eat enough protein, we eat a variety of foods, you're getting that mix of amino acids anyway. She didn't realize, but we have these pools of amino acids in our bodies that we store any excesses. So we eat a bowl of pea soup and we get a little extra lysine. We store it for the next meal. The next meal, we have a couple slices of toast and we're not getting enough lysine. We'll just take it from the protein pools to build amino acids. So if generally you're eating a good variety, and over the course of 24 hours, you really don't have to worry about combining. Thank you again for coming out.
Thank you so much. We really owe Brenda Davis a big mahalo for this wonderful presentation tonight. And thank you so much, everybody. Mahalo for coming. Have a safe drive home.